Case Western. I'd tell you more about the Institute, but I want to leave all the time, as much time as possible for Professor Moore, so please check out our website. It's my privilege today to introduce Professor Peter Moore, who is an associate professor of political science here at Case Western. He is a graduate of VMI. You've come in interesting ways, and the University of Virginia, and then earned his PhD at McGill. He just spent this past year on a Fulbright fellowship in Dubai, and he will be speaking on American nation-state building in Iraq. And without anything further, Professor Moore.
Thank you. Do you need me to speak in this, or can I move around? Need me to speak in it? All right, that's fine. That's all right. Thank you for this opportunity. What I'm going to present to you today is a component of a larger research project that I've been working on for a while. The larger project is on changes in the Iraqi political economy before and after 2003. It's a comparative project looking at other cases of civil war in the Middle East. But what I want to present to you today is a few of my findings that I think bear on a larger debate regarding U.S. nation-state building in the developing world, the lessons we draw from Iraq, and then their application or their non-application to Afghanistan going forward. Paul Bremer, everybody's favorite whipping boy, in 2003 had what I think is a sadly ironic statement. And it's important to understand what Bremer and officials in Washington thought they were going to get in a post-invasion Iraq. They believed they were going to get a liberal economic order with transparent rules and the basis of a productive economic environment. Instead, today we look back on Iraq, an estimated $17 billion in capital has left the country. At least 2 million people are externally displaced, and what's important about these displaced people is they're the private sector, the middle class, the professional class on which any society relies for economic development. There's been millions of barrels of oil smuggled since 2003, and then the latest World Bank estimates have about 30% of young males in Iraq are unemployed. The argument I'm going to develop today essentially argues that the Iraqi political economy is deeply fragmented. And to paraphrase or to pivot off Bremer, doing business today in Iraq is not for the meek. Let me move back now and introduce this issue of nation-state building. After 9/11, the White House argued that the primary threat to the United States was not from conquering states, but rather from failed states. And so the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan were built on a premise of nation building. And one of the advocates, James Dobbins, in a recent book, edited volume on nation-state building, gives what I think is a good definition. It's the use of military force to underpin a transition to democracy. One might say that in the latter part of the Bush administration, Washington pulled away from these experiments in nation-state building. But it lives on today in the U.S. military. If you look at the U.S. military manual, the new manual written by David Petraeus, it's clear that counterinsurgency contains key elements of nation-state building. Political reform and economic development are seen as tactics or strategies towards fighting insurgents. And I think this is the argument for those that want to advocate a surge in troops and a surge in nation building currently in Afghanistan. But this opens the question, is state nation building by the Americans, is this something that's a post-Cold War phenomenon, or is it something we've only seen since 9/11? And actually observers are there's a consensus among observers that American nation-state building goes back much further. There's an agreement that there are about 18 cases of attempted American nation-state building dating from the period of Reconstruction in the American South. When you look at this list, and the measurement here is democracy after 10 years, I adapted this table from another book by Francis Fukuyama on nation-state building. What's obviously striking is that of 18 cases, we only have 4 cases of successful nation-state building. Now, no offense to those that study the Caribbean, but Panama and Grenada, I think we can agree, are particular exceptions, being very small, and the interventions were very brief. Rather, most of the debates focuses around what are deemed to be successes in Germany, West Germany, and Japan. So this opens up the question, what explains this variation? Why so many apparent failures and so few successes? Advocates, again, I'm going to rely on James Dobbins. Currently, James Dobbins is at the RAND Corporation, and there's a large effort to finalize, it may be coming out in the next few weeks, a large history of the Coalition Provisional Authority. But the advocates are rather clear. What they argue is that successful nation-state building by the United States depends primarily on political will, the marshaling of resources. That is, stick to it. Don't pull out of Afghanistan, don't pull out of Iraq. The longer we try, the more political will we have, the better chance for success. Critics, on the other hand, and I'm utilizing an excellent piece by a colleague, Jason Brownlee, who wrote in World Politics, a nice review piece looking at this larger debate about nation-state building. Brownlee argues that it's not will or political resources. Rather, the U.S. does best when it does less. And the important variable to explain success in Japan and West Germany and the failure in most other places are the antecedent conditions, the political institutions, the economy. So for my focus, it's the political economy. So West Germany and Japan can be explained not by American will or amount of money spent, but by the simple fact that Japan and West Germany had already established robust domestic economies, a history of history of parliament, and a shared national identity. So what I want to do now is move back to Iraq, reintroduce the Iraqi case, and use it as a simple window on this larger debate. We talk about Iraq as an economy, as a political economy. It's usually considered a type, and it's called a rentier state. Rentier states are often oil states. There's a lot of them in the developing world. So in addition to Iraq, we have Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Nigeria, Angola. And these rentier states are defined by three major characteristics. First, the revenue, and in this case we're talking about oil, is external. Most of the money comes from the outside. Number two, few produce. And this is rather straightforward because oil extraction is not labor intensive. And in fact, since the mid-50s, which was the period when oil money really starts to hit the Iraqi economy, very few Iraqis are involved in the production of the oil resources. And then number three, and this is the most important concept in the political terms, the state controls these resources. So the state, through ownership of oil industry, directly soaks up the profits. This kind of definition of the rentier state's good because it gives us an idea how to differentiate between the Kuwaits of the world and the Jordans of the world. However, it doesn't let us into understanding exactly the politics of a rentier state, because essentially what rentier states are about is getting external money and distributing it domestically. And so to do that, you need to have distribution institutions. So what I've done in this research is I've tried to unpack what I consider are the four major distributional institutions in the Iraqi economy, really since the 1960s until today. There's four. First, public employment. That's pretty straightforward. Oil states use money to expand civil service payrolls, to employ more for the state as a political tactic to solidify legitimacy, solidify a regime. Trade institutions speak to how a rentier state gets goods from the outside and distributes them domestically. Finance speaks to the banking sector, who controls the money supply. And then property rights deals with who defines property rights and how are they adjudicated. So what I want to do is kind of walk you through a historical narrative of what I call the rise and demise of the Iraqi rentier state. And just as a caveat, and I can talk about this more in question and answer, but this research is part of a larger project where I'm looking at the economy of Algeria and Lebanon, which are two other cases in the Middle East of prolonged civil war. And to put it mildly, doing research on these types of entities is extremely difficult. There's big data problems. There's a lot of questions I still have. So I want you to understand that what I'm presenting is, in a way, still preliminary results. But when we look at Iraq, essentially we have the period of 1968, that's the period of the consolidation of Ba'athist rule in Baghdad, until 1980. This is the period of the maturation of the Iraqi rentier state. Or another way to put it, what the Ba'athists created in 1970s was a political economy of social control where the state dominated all four of these distribution networks. So I'll just go through each of them. First, public employment. We know from the minimal amount of data we have that public sector employment skyrocketed in the 70s in Iraq. But unlike other rentier states, it topped out at about 25% to a third of the labor force working for the government. You contrast that with Kuwait or Saudi, we're talking about 90% of the labor force. So it was increasing and important, but it never reached the levels that we find in other rentier states. The trade sector was one of the most important because Iraq set up what was a very unique system. There's essentially 13 to 15 main economic ministries in Baghdad, and beneath those ministries are about 200 state-owned enterprises. Beginning in the 1970s, these ministries and institutions directly imported goods from external suppliers and distributed these goods in state-owned retail networks. This accounted for, by 1979, 90% of all of Iraqi consumables was coming through this state-managed trade system, this monopoly. In terms of finance in the 1970s, Iraq has a public bank financial system. There's very little room for private banks. Property rights is an area I'm still working on. It's incredibly important in both pre- and post-conflict situations, the status of property rights. It's also very difficult to get information on this. But what we know is that once the revolution occurs in 58 in Iraq, and then the Ba'athists consolidate power in 68, we're going to get a series of efforts at rural land reform, essentially taking land from large landowners and attempting to distribute it to smaller landowners in rural areas. Other areas in pre-1980 Iraq where we begin to have issues of property rights is in the city of Kirkuk, where Arabs migrated and Kurds were displaced. 1980 is a crucial year. 1980 is the point at which the war that Saddam Hussein had launched on Iran turns to Iraqi territory. Iraq's only pipeline through Syria is cut off. The regime from 1982 up until 2003 is under severe financial strain, austerity, the destructions of wars and bombing by the Americans. And so we're going to see significant change in all four of these distributional institutions. First, public employment begins to decline. Now, the idea here is you have to exclude military service in the 80s, because in the 80s, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis are in the military fighting the war in Iran. But our best guess and the only piece of data we have on this is a household survey conducted in 86 by the Iraqi government, suggests that increasingly Iraqis are finding other sources of income, local sources, rent, the informal market, as opposed to sources of income from the state. Big changes in the trade network occur after 1982. The regime, bereft of money, increasingly under pressure in the mid-'80s, leading up through the early 1990s, sells off a number of these import monopolies and state-owned economic enterprises. The important point here is who they sell them to, because the regime sells these assets to military, security, and individuals close to the regime. So in a sense, we're getting in the 1980s and increasingly in the 1980s and increasingly in the 1990s, the creation of a new Iraqi private sector, but one which has close linkages to the regime. In terms of finance, there were efforts to privatize the Iraqi banking industry in the 80s, but essentially by the early 1990s, the Iraqi dinar collapses in value. Iraqis pull their money out of the banking system, and for all intent and purposes, after the 1990s, Iraq is a cash economy, dollar cash economy. Finally, in terms of property rights, similar to the sell-off of trade assets and state-owned enterprises in the late 80s, the government sells off and privatizes, either leases or sells, a significant amount of rural land. Again, the purchasers of these land assets and some agricultural businesses are military and security personnel closely tied to the regime. So if we step back in aggregation and look at this situation, what we have on the eve of the U.S. invasion is a deeply fragmented Iraqi political economy. in which these distribution institutions that were born of the state still exist, but their operation depends ever more on groups and regions outside the direct control of the regime. And, also important, we have the evolution of this new private sector. A private sector which is connected now to regional importers, but also, and I think this is an important thing to understand about this private sector, this is a private sector that acts clandestinely. Especially in the 1990s when there's a sanctions regime on Iraq, it's this private sector, which operates essentially as organized crime, is able to help the Iraqi regime circumvent the sanctions. So now the question becomes 2003. What effect does the U.S. invasion have on this trajectory of the Iraqi economy? Advocates of the CPA, and by extension advocates of nation-state building, argue that the CPA actually did have some economic successes. They argued that the imposition of a new Iraqi dinar, the stabilization of the currency, was a success, but that any failures of the CPA were really not failures of the CPA, but were failures because of high expectations that Iraqis had for what would happen after the invasion. Seen from a critical perspective, however, when you actually look at all of the things the CPA tried to do, there was a lot of declarations, but very little implementation. Rather, I want to argue that the U.S. invasion was consequential, but it wasn't consequential in the way normally viewed. Rather, what happened was the U.S. invasion aggravated already resident political economy trends that were present in the country. And I'm thinking of two particular directions. Number one, the invasion destroyed that central political control that, no matter how tenuous, still held together this ministry system of imports and of import networks. And second, the invasion of Iraq opened up Iraq's borders. In the terminology of the CPA, it was called tariff reform, but what it was really, in reality, was a throwing open of Iraq's borders to regional actors and regional interests so that they could get their piece of the Iraqi pie. So now I'm going to move back to those four distributional institutions and give you an idea about their fate after the U.S. invasion. First, in terms of public employment, again, we don't have good data on this. We now have a World Bank household survey 2 years ago, but one of the kind of interesting things I found out about how surveys are done in post-2003 Iraq, they're all routed through the Ministry of Planning. However, the same sample of households is used for every survey. They don't vary the household choices. So you can imagine that, and we have a lot of data based on these households. So with that in mind, that household survey more or less confirms what we saw in the 80s, which are Iraqis are consistently as a household accessing other sources of income besides those mediated by the state. So in terms of public employment, my argument is that increasingly local provincial control is where the influence in public employment is, which is one reason we see so much importance placed on provincial elections in Iraq. Also, local provinces have now a great deal more control over public work contracts, and it's also provincial governors, at least through my research, that really are the most closely associated with smuggling networks in today's Iraq. The trade regime has been one of the most notorious elements after the U.S. invasion. What we've seen is essentially that Ba'athist control of the ministry network has collapsed. And what's replaced it, especially after 2005 when we get Iraqi elections, are the ascendant Shia parties, which are not monoliths, pieces of these parties, figures, personalities, getting control of these different ministries and different state-owned economic enterprises and crafting their own corrupt trade relationships with external suppliers. And it's difficult to understate the level of this corruption, the fact that it's been intersected with violence. We've seen over the last year a number of ministry bombings, some of which I argue derives from these struggles around controlling what's left of this distributional network. And then I would also add, in terms of the trade regime, another element that is new in post-2003 Iraq is the U.S. military now comprises an entire economic strata of its own, where Iraqis are middlemen supplying U.S. military bases. And then just today in the Financial Times, there's an article about former CPA officials and U.S. government occupation officials, including Zalmay Khalilzad, Jay Garner, and Bremer, are all now getting into business in Iraq with many of the same people they worked with before. And whether or not that is corrupt or unethical really doesn't matter, because the perceptions of Iraqis, I can guarantee you, of that type of situation are quite negative. Let me just advance real quick and give you, keeping on this trade regime idea, this is sort of a good depiction of the major trade routes coming into Iraq. And so when I speak about fragmentation in the import networks, what I'm talking about is fragmentation along these lines. So we have a number of goods coming over from Turkey, where the two major Kurdish parties in the north have more or less carved up fiefdoms. The import route from Jordan is still dominated by ex-Ba'athist Sunni tribal interest in Ramadi and Fallujah. And then the newest trade route coming from Dubai, where I was, and also Iran, is been divvied up by the major Shiite parties in the south. Finally, in terms of finance, that cash economy that Iraq kind of devolved into in the early 90s has continued. We do now have private banks in Iraq. Warqa Bank is a very successful bank owned by a very successful Sunni merchant family. However, most people don't use these banks. Iraq is still a cash economy to the extent, and I know this sounds absolutely bizarre, but many of the contracts that are paid by ministries are paid in cash, of trucks that are driven across borders, and goods are swapped at the border with cash. And so one of the main crippling and fragmentary elements of the Iraqi economy is this completely decayed financial system. Finally, in terms of property rights, again, not a lot of information we have here. The government, the new Iraqi government, has set up a commission to adjudicate pre-2003 property claims. This is mostly property claims revolving around Kirkuk. However, we have very little information about what the status of, say, residential property in neighborhoods in Baghdad that have been ethnically cleansed, or in the rural areas, land that was either sold or leased to individuals before 2003. To summarize this, post-2003, we have an even more fragmented Iraqi economy and larger political economy. We have now a new private sector, one that's in competition with that old private sector, and also a private sector that's connected to political, militia, party interests that in many ways continues to resemble organized crime in its operations and its intents. Overall, there's a lack of state regulation, and in general, if we were to look just in the political economy sphere, Iraq still looks much like a failed state that we would see in Lebanon during the Civil War, Somalia, or Angola during its Civil War. So what's the upshot of all of this? Well, it's pretty obvious now where I stand in this debate. Success and failure of nation-state building does not hinge on willpower or resources. Rather, it hinges on the antecedent conditions. Another way to see this is the surge, right? We all know about the surge in Iraq. The surge in Iraq was argued to be a success because American troops and Iraqi troops were put on the street to stop intra-sectarian violence. But seen from another critical perspective, the surge can actually be seen as a form of accommodation. That the Americans came to Iraq wanting to change pathologies in Iraq's politics and its economies, and in the end, they accommodated themselves to it. The surge, or the Americans, didn't change Iraq. Iraq changed the Americans. And finally, the condition of Iraqi society. I've been doing this research since 2004. I've interviewed over 200 Iraqi businessmen. Most of my work's been in Jordan, Turkey, Syria, Dubai. My wife won't let me go to Iraq, and last year I asked the U.S. State Department if I could go to Iraq, and they would only let me go to the green zone. But what's important to understand is at the end of the day, this is not about a case, this is about people. And one of the things that the last 30 years of Iraq has shown us is the tremendous survival skills and adaptability of Iraqis. Unfortunately, surviving is not enough to change the conditions in which Iraq finds itself. And so going forward, one of the few things that the Bush administration ever expressed, and I agree with, is that Iraqis are going to have to rebuild their nation state. It can't be done by the Americans. Thank you.
absent a microphone, I'll just ask you to speak up with your question.
Okay. Oh, they'll speak up and I'll speak in the mic. Yes.
If we were to pull out of Iraq tomorrow, what would happen?
It's a good question. You know, I would say that in terms of the violence, much of what's been perpetrated, the divisions of the communities, has already been done. It's unlikely that we're going to see Anbari Sunnis marching on Najaf or Karbala or the Kurds moving south. Rather, we would see particular areas where we could see a lot of violence, Kirkuk, Mosul being the obvious ones. But in terms of these longer trajectories in where Iraq was and where it's headed, in my opinion, I don't think much will change. One of the best observers of modern Iraq is Nir Rosen, and he had a pretty pithy, depressing thing to say about a year and a half ago. He said, Iraq doesn't exist anymore. It's rather regions. And I think it's important to understand here in an American context that we can't boil Iraqi identities down to sex. It's a lot more complicated than that. But from many of the individuals I speak with, people that spend a lot of their time doing business, it's regions. If you're going to do business in Baghdad, where in Baghdad? With which ministry? That's going to determine who you hire. And so this adaptability of Iraqis is quite incredible. They've already set themselves up to a system where, as a Sunni businessman, if I'm going to do business with a Shia ministry, I hire a Shia frontman. And so that could mean, well, that sectarian differences are breaking down in Iraq, but it could also mean that Iraqis have simply adapted themselves to a situation in which they find themselves. So I think there would be violence. I think Kirkuk and Mosul is still yet to be determined. Some Sunnis one might speak with that are more traditional, hardcore Baathists believe the fight's not over, that the Sunnis have not lost. So from that perspective, I think there's many chances. But equally, if the United States were to stay, I think if you flip it around that way, I think many of these trends would carry through in the way that they've carried through anyway. I mean, I see the U.S. invasion sort of like a rock in a stream. The Iraqi society and politics has moved around it.
Anyway, I understand that we have built about 18 different military bases in Iraq. We spend billions of dollars. I also understand we were told that we are going to withdraw in 2011. So are we going to withdraw? Are we going to leave these bases behind, or it's just a way to say that we are leaving the cities, but we are still occupying Iraq?
You know, I really find Washington and American politics completely baffling. So I really don't know what they're intending to do in Washington. But what I can tell you is that what these bases represent is significant. There's now an entire strata of middlemen Iraqis that what a U.S. military base requires a tremendous amount of supplies every day. And so there's now this kind of strata, just like there would be of translators, who take U.S. military contracts and then match them up with suppliers in Jordan and Turkey and Kuwait. And the sad thing about this is that these military bases are very economically important. They're spending a lot of money, but they're not spending it in Iraq. They're drawing their resources from outside the country. And the people that they're employing, and I've interviewed scores of these individuals, are very clever, multilinguistic, but they are in no way going to invest in Iraq or stay in Iraq. In fact, most of them have their residences in Kuwait, Dubai, and Jordan. So if and when U.S. military bases really leave, all of this resources and this wealth that's been spent will go with it. These are enclaves over which there's not going to be any lasting local benefits. And then, of course, one could ask about the fate of these Iraqis who, once their American benefactors leave, they're not going to be safe in their own country, and it certainly appears that the United States is not going to be welcoming in allowing Iraqis to come here.
Is it on? Yeah. So I wanted to know if you think there's there are prospects for a resurgence of the center and sort of for another strong man where we might get a return to a rentier type state? And then I'm just wondering if there's been a rethink among academics about rentier states and whether, from the U.S. point of view, if you read the academic literature, there's always it's always focused on the perverse effects. But I'm wondering, after our experience of the last so many years, if there's been people who think, rentier states aren't so bad after all.
Yeah. Actually, just the other day, ExxonMobil announced, again, we have to take a lot of these announcements of oil contracts and foreign investment in Iraq as declaratory but not implemented. But at least they've made the statement that they've signed a 10-year deal, and the expectation is that in the next 10 years, Iraq, and this comes from the central government, is planning to boost production to 10 million barrels a day. Now, they're around 2.5 now. 10 million would put them up there with Saudi Arabia. That's quite ambitious. Assuming that would be true, the kind of money that would be earned from that would on paper replicate the kind of structural conditions of the 70s. So in a sense, the resources are there to recreate that type of rentier state. But again, it's going to be built from what's left over now. And so we don't know what that would look like. The rentier state that was built in the 70s was built off the revolution in 58. So I think going out at least 10 years is a chance that this could be, that Humpty Dumpty could be put back together. But the pieces on the ground are going to be very different than they are now. We don't know, for instance, what the status of Kirkuk will look like. It's looking very doubtful if many of those 2 million exiles will return. And, of course, the role of external states now in Iraq is much more important than it was previous. On the rethink of the rentier state, I don't know. I think there's been a lot of revision about the rentier state, and part of this project is to capture a component of that in looking at distribution elements as being more important than simply just the source of the revenue. But I haven't detected any kind of rethink in American policy circles that maybe these things are great, that maybe we should go back to that and focus on stability. A lot of this investment that's coming from former or business activity from former U.S. occupation authorities is focused in northern Iraq, Kurdistan, and in the oil sector. So that shows where these guys are thinking the money's going to come.
Thanks for your lecture. And my question is more about the pathology behind this sort of nation-state, nation-building discourse. So if it's predicated on the idea of political will, then one would guess that you would just have to keep trying harder forever with no end in sight. So what are the effects that this has on sort of the U.S. military in terms of, is this actually make money for the U.S. military? Is this good for business for the United States? Like, what are these internal logics to this sort of discourse and how they, you mentioned how Iraq changed us, but how this changes in a broader scheme, because theoretically you could replicate this model on Iran, on Pakistan, on Afghanistan, which I think they're kind of doing on Afghanistan now anyway. So, thanks.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I would unpack it. I think that in an aggregate sense, all the money that's been spent on counterinsurgency in Iraq and eventually was spent in Afghanistan is a net drain. I mean, it'd be nice to have that $800 billion that we spent on Iraq maybe to handle the banks or the TARP or whatever. But unpacking it, yeah, there's clearly a constituency for this. I mean, coin's not just a thing, it's a interest group within the U.S. military. They are heavily invested in this. And I mean, I'm a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. I'm no enemy of the military. I have a lot of colleagues in the military, and they're very honest with me. These kinds of battles within the U.S. military are intra-bureaucratic battles that have nothing to do with Iraq, that have everything to do with what's going to be the next general slot, who's going to get, general slots are important. So Special Forces gets a general slot. Public Relations now has one. So they're a real career investment here. But the larger question you're asking is how we benefit, and I think that's a good question, because in the long run, once we go back to this, all these efforts, one has to ask, the typical economist question, what were the opportunity costs here? How much money and lives were spent on all of these failed fantasies that could have been spent elsewhere? So it's very obvious, I'm extremely doubtful of the ability to carry forward counterinsurgency, because, as you said, it's almost like a unending war. All we need is a little bit more political will. All we need is a little bit more people from the State Department, more Arabic speakers, more Pashtun speakers. But the historical records suggest that that's simply not what the most important factor is.
Thank you for your lecture. Question. Obama recently said that he's going to send 40,000 extra troops to Afghanistan and that he's going to slowly start pulling troops out of Iraq. How does the whole pulling troops out of Iraq and into Afghanistan affect this whole political situation? Because I fear that once we start pulling troops out of Iraq and into Afghanistan, all the insurgents are going to leave Afghanistan and come back to Iraq.
Well, yeah. One thing I would caution is that from and this is no secret, everybody the U.S. military arrests, usually in Iraq and Afghanistan, are local. Iraqis are not flying over to Kabul, and Afghanis aren't coming to Anbar. However, I take your question. It's a good one. And from what I understand, the debate seems to be regarding Afghanistan, is it going to be coin light or coin heavy? Coin light would be Joe Biden's idea of just sending, focusing on killing the bad guys, and let's set aside all this political reform and economic development stuff. And of course, that runs the problem that, what are we propping up there? If we're not going to attempt to fix these pathologies, then what are we doing there in the first place? And in terms of the pullout of Iraq, it's not yet decided. We've got an election coming up in Iraq, which, by the way, the law that came down, the agreed law, there's a new electoral law that the Iraqi parliament passed, portions of which are directly translated from English from our ambassador, Ambassador Hill. So the fate of that election is going to really determine whether or not Obama is going to have the troops freed up to move to Afghanistan. So in many ways, we're still prisoner of events in Iraq are going to determine whether or not we can send them to Afghanistan.
A lot of the critique of American nation building in Iraq is focused on the version of nation building, that it's a neoliberal nation building. That's the theme of imperial life in the Emerald City. And you see the same thing in New Orleans after Katrina, that everything's been washed clean, and this is the opportunity to have low taxes and privatization, et cetera, et cetera. Suggested in all of that is the possibility that nation building done right might be more successful. I know you're suggesting otherwise, but are there other examples, perhaps not American examples, of nation building done well that might be relevant?
Let me think. First, the British in Malaysia usually is example, but there, to do that, the British committed ethnic cleansing, walled off people, shipped a bunch of them out of the country. Those today are generally considered, I guess, war crimes or crimes against humanity. So that's maybe not the best model to follow. What was the first part of your question about? Thank you. It is interesting when you go back and look at, because the CPA is real good about having all their documents, and the RAND Corporation now has this large project, the history of the CPA, and Paul Bremer's documents are 100,000 pages floating out there that I've got a Freedom of Information Act to get. And when you look through some of this stuff, it's very clear the kinds of things that they were talking about were just straight off neoliberal But at the same time, how quickly they were abandoned, you're talking about days. In a report one week, they would be talking about, reforming the Iraqi stock market, and then the next week they wouldn't mention it at all. So you're right. I think that these ideas kind of cropped up very early and then were very quickly. And I guess it speaks to this issue, and my colleague Jason Brownlee raised this in his piece. I mean, and this is not a defense of the CPA, but what choices did they have? I mean, one critique of the CPA, and that was in the Emerald Palace book, was debathification. Well, if Paul Bremer didn't debathify, forget the size of debathification, but if he didn't debathify, what was he supposed to tell all of these exiled leaders that they brought in and these newly ascendant Shia parties that had been fighting the Baathists for decades? It was a no-win situation. And so, that's exactly the critique of nation building. You're putting yourself in a quagmire where there's no easy way out, and every decision has high costs. And I would say that's where we find ourselves today in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Just a quick question regarding alternatives. What alternatives do you suggest, and also how to keep the situation in the Middle East entirely from getting ridiculously destabilized more so than it currently is? For example, if the U.S. leaves, then obviously Iran will be able to come in. Syria might work with Iran to come in, but then you also have these other, like Kuwait. What happens with Kuwait? Saudi Arabia try to come in and fight it there as well.
Right. Well, the alternative is just not to invade. We've already done that. Right. But I think look at this is not a new critique. People have been making this argument for a long time in the United States, but for some reason it doesn't resonate in Washington, or it doesn't seem to resonate in the American public. So, I mean, the alternative is to have a much clearer vision of exactly what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. As to your larger question on the Middle East, I'm an area specialist. I mean, I'm in this job in part because I love going to that part of the world. However, from purely an American perspective, it's not that important. I think one of the things that we missed after 9/11 was a serious sit-down of an assessment of the threat. How threatened are we by whatever we want? What threats are we talking about, and how do we compare them? And because we've jumped the gun on threat, and we assume now it's a threat, everything emanating out of the Middle East is a threat, it generates this desire to get involved in the region. Deeply involved in things like the electoral law in Iraq, deeply involved in civil society issues in Jordan, deeply involved in elections in Egypt. And in reality, I think, I love that part of the world, but frankly, it's not that important. It's not. Our national security in economic and political terms is elsewhere. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing different things in the Middle East. But in response to your question about pulling out and then things could happen here, things could happen there, I'm just not too concerned about it in terms of our interests. At the end of the day, these governments in these regions have to deal with their own people. And that's what we should be encouraging them to do, deal with their own people.
One of the neoconservative arguments for going into Iraq and their general project for the new American century was that this was our opportunity to get control of oil in the Middle East. And so I'd like you, if you would, discuss what has happened with oil. I mean, is the United States more in control of oil as a result of our nation building in Iraq, or are we less in control? What actually has happened as far as oil is concerned?
I'm not completely sure. I think it would be a stretch to say we're more in control of oil because of our invasion of Iraq, because the most important oil producer is Saudi Arabia, and we more or less have a very tight relationship with them. And it's hard to look at intent. It's hard to discern intent. However, when we start to put this together and we look at oil deals that are being signed, many of them completely non-transparent, one does have to recognize that a big claim coming from Iraqis and Arabs in general was that this invasion was generated by a desire to grab oil. Again, that's an intention that's hard to discern, but it certainly looks like the actions, and we should be very, very sensitive to this, to not do anything which looks like that. But when you have these former occupation officials getting into the oil business, when you have Exxon, and most of the negotiations actually over the oil contracts were done in Dubai. They weren't even done in Baghdad. One has to ask, this question about what is, to what extent it was driven by oil. But I wouldn't say that we have more control over oil than we did before. I think that the days of that kind of relationship with the U.S. having companies and the Europeans having companies that actually control production, those days are way behind us. Now, there are other ways to influence the oil market short of military intervention, which could be at play. But I would say no, I don't think we're in much better control over it. I mean, one of the things, and I didn't present this in my research, is that, today is that one of the really amazing things that occurred after the U.S. invasion, really beginning in 2004 and then just peaking in 2008, was massive oil smuggling that was coming out of southern Iraq at facilities that were protected and secured by American contractors in international waters that were patrolled by U.S. warships. And I've talked to a number of people that were the shippers, had the ships go up there to get oil. Much of the spot market was located in Dubai and Sharjah and also in Iran. And everybody to a person says that, yes, they went daily past U.S. ships, that they were offloading smuggled oil right in front of contractors. And so there's another whole set of questions about what did the U.S. Navy know and why didn't they do anything about oil smuggling? Because it's clear that they never, ever intervened in this process, which still to this day exists. There's still a lot of oil smuggling, although it's not as large as it was in 2008 because of the price of oil. But while I was in Dubai, I went out with a guy, and in international waters, there's this, remember that bad Kevin Costner movie, Waterworld? Right? There's a version of Waterworld about 11 and a half miles off the coast of Sharjah, where smuggled oil from Iraq comes, and then other guys come up and they swap the oil there and pay, and then they go their opposite ways. So, and I was told by guys running that they just wave at U.S. ships as they go by. The oil usually is washed into the local service system. Oil doesn't have a tag on it, so oil is smuggled down from Iraq or into Iran. It ends up in the spot market where oil can be bought and mixed with legitimate oil in various storage facilities in the UAE. The estimates were Iraq was exporting somewhere between 2 to 2.5 million barrels a day, and the highest estimates were 500,000 barrels a day were being smuggled through the south to Turkey and to Jordan, and made a lot of people. There was a lot of money made, a lot of money.
So, thank you again for very insightful comments that you have. And there's a question that I had regarding the sort of isolated economy that's been developed around the American effort in Iraq, either with the bases or with servicemen and the middlemen in Iraq and their relation to that effort that America has put into the state. But part of your lecture seemed to hinge on Iraq retaining and maintaining its identity as a rentier state. And what, if any, possibilities exist for U.S. power, not necessarily through military power, but through economic and financial power, to influence an economy in Iraq that's not fractionalized, it's not based off of oil production and therefore requiring to be disbursed through a central facility like a government, and sort of the growing of a middleman class that seek to be these frontmen for Sunnis or for Shiites or for Americans or for Iranians.
Yeah. So I guess the underlying theme here is that my subfield's called political economy. So I'm interested in how politics affect economic outcomes and how economic variables affect political outcomes. And in this case, or in most of the cases, those of us that are on the political side tend to argue that it's the political that drives the economic. And that what underlines American development policy in the developing world generally, and specifically in conflict zones or post-conflict zones, is this belief that if we somehow kickstart development open up small businesses, then entrepreneurs and private sector actors will change the environment around them. And in actuality, all too often it's the other way around, that entrepreneurs take money and exploit the social and political situation in which they find themselves. And so, in a way, we've got it backwards. If we're serious about, either in countries we occupy or in countries we're aiding, if we're serious about economic development, we should look at the case studies where it's the politics and the society that gets changed first, and then the economic follows. So under the current situation, I don't think there's much we can do. Now, there are various aid programs, targeted aid, training programs especially. I mean, many of those 2 million exiled Iraqis are professionals, doctors, lawyers, professors. And one of the great tragedies, and this is a society, Iraqi society, that in the 1970s, most people were coming to their universities. In Jordan, in Syria, and in the UAE, where most of these Iraqis are located, they're not allowed to practice. They can't practice medical. They're not allowed to teach in the universities. They're not allowed to be practicing engineers. And so if we're really serious about trying to resuscitate or save, we should get serious about those refugees. Put some pressure on at least 2 of those countries are our allies about instituting work programs, skills programs, because what's going to happen is eventually these people are no longer going to be qualified, and we're going to have a permanent refugee population of about 2.5 million Iraqis. And as a general rule, refugee populations in the Middle East generally aren't good. They don't produce benefits. So I would argue that targeting that area, and then also having a much more critical approach to the types of aid that we're providing to the Iraqi government and not to direct societal actors, because I think that's where aid programs can be perverted. The government can manipulate who gets the money and who doesn't.
As a follow-up to that,
Yeah.
I guess to clarify, the idea of the Americans have invaded physically, whether through force of arms and through weapons, but and I understand that your point that the political and economic change can sometimes be backwards. But what about the idea, where is the conversation about forcibly moving in economic institutions from the states into Iraq? Not necessarily saying, and there are a lot of concerns that would follow this, but what stops the conversation from starting? Why isn't Intel setting up work-study programs in Iraq for Iraqis? Why are we setting up U.S. military bases and not, say, U.S. corporations to help kickstart Iraqi citizens to become functioning, productive members of their society that can turn around and shape the institution and the economies that they live in? I mean, that
Right.
really, why is that conversation not happening?
I mean, from a business perspective in the U.S., there's no payoff there. I mean, you can't even, it's difficult for the U.S. government to get State Department employees to go to Afghanistan and Iraq. Can you imagine like someone in Silicon Valley or, Washington State saying, oh yeah, I'll take 6 months in Hilla. That's a town in Iraq. But I understand what you're saying. I think that in a way, the reason that conversation's not happening is we've moved beyond it. The U.S. military's already made the decision. When I made that argument that the surge is really about Iraq changing America, the U.S. military completely accommodated itself. On the payroll in Anbar are the same guys that were killing our soldiers. On the payroll in Ramadi and Fallujah are people who are flat-out criminals in an organized sense with lots of blood on their hands. And so from the perspective at the tactical level, what's going on here is I'm trying to protect my guys. And so if it means paying off this guy or giving this guy some easy public works contracts, if he's going to stop firing at me, fine. Economic development, that's way down the road. I don't really care about that. What I care about is protecting my guys. And so in a way, the conversation's moved already past that. We're talking about stability in a way. I think the nation-state building project in Iraq is over with, and the surge was sort of the death knell. The U.S. is not going to make these types of efforts anymore. We've accommodated ourselves to what the reality of Iraq is.
I think we'll make one last question.
I was following up on your point about, are there other examples of nation builders out there more successful than the United States? I was going to say, and I wonder what you think about this, is the best example is the Western European countries through the EU, who first with the fragile countries of Portugal, Spain, and Greece, and then after the Cold War, integrating those countries. Because what they do is it's a full, like the U.S., they try to make other countries look like them, but they do a full transformation of societies. The
That's a
legal
good point.
structure, the economy.
Right.
You have to do all these things to get the goodies of the free trade area. But we don't use the word nation building, but
Right.
essentially that's what it is.
You're right, yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think that would sort of fit. And then another one just came to mind is Japanese colonialism in Korea. I mean, just butcher the landlords, forcibly remake society. And there is an argument that part of South Korean economic success is premised on the brutality of Japanese colonialism. But I didn't think about the EU example. That's a pretty good one. And that took place over a much longer period, too, right? Talking decades, slow process.
It's a 10, 15-year process before you. Turkey's a good example now.
Yeah.
The changes going on inside Turkey.
And that brings up another key difference, though. I mean, another point that Jason Brownlee raised in this paper is said, look, one of the things that the political elements of external nation-state building that's always going to be problematic is there's no accountability. I mean, Jay Garner's not accountable. Bremer's not accountable. And in the EU case, you're pointing out the local politicians in these countries were accountable for the changes they were taking on, right? I mean, it wasn't an EU governorship from the UK or France that was in, and so accountability and maybe timing are more important factors to look at. But yeah, I didn't think about the EU example. Do they call it? They don't call it state nation building. It's probably just, what's the term?
Well, it's
Harmonization of.
enlargement, maybe accession. There's lots of very euphemistic language that gets used.
Right. Maybe one day we'll make Iraq a state. We'll all be one big happy family.
On that note, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking. And as a token of our gratitude, this
wow.
isn't just a tote bag, but also a fleece, which of course advertises the institute.
Hey, we got to get this kind of stuff for political science. Why don't we have this, huh? That's nice. Thanks. Awesome. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Oh, and there is, please join us for refreshments. I'm not sure if they're in the lower rotunda or upstairs, but they'll be easily found. Somebody will know.
Hey, thanks for the questions. Appreciate it. Are you a student here? Good. Good, yeah. International stuff's very important. Oh, War Crimes Lab. More cheerful stuff. Hi. Hey. Oh, great. Oh, I wonder why we haven't met. Oh, okay. Sure. Yeah. I don't have, all my cards are gone. But you can just drop me, what's your name? Carl. I'm Pete. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Good. Thanks. Nice meeting you. All right. Hey, Josh. How's it going, man? This is my colleague, Josh.
You're in public science?
This is the big one. Hi. See, DC, that's what